The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guest are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the O.R. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, C.O.R.E. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National C.O.R.E. and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Good morning. This is Dr. Oba Tashaka, and greetings to the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. And I see Brother Dreamchild on there and Sister Lisa Grayson, the early risers. Greetings to both of you and others who will be coming on. So today's show is going to be like a part 2 of last week when I announced the creation of the P.A.P.O House of Life, Amilcar Cabral, Ella Baker Leadership Institute. I want to clarify, I've been doing leadership training under this institute for years in the community, but this is announcing the creation of it on a platform, in this case, YouTube, Facebook, and other platforms that will come. So this is going to be part 2, and we're getting into another dimension of this. But before getting into that, what I wanted to do was to mention a few improvements that have been made on the show and some improvements that will come. The first one you've seen, that the little banner that runs under the show that Brother Lawrence Freelo put up. The second one, and it actually precedes it, by Brother Ugawa. He's been, as I pointed out before, volunteering his time and taking a number of the presentations. We have close to 90 now, and cutting them into 3 2-minute bites and putting them on Twitter. And we're going to be setting up Instagram real soon. And this has shown up in the analytics in that we've generated a nice little viewership coming off of Twitter. And so, as I said before, I want to thank Brother Ugawa, who I hear from regularly. We have some good exchanges, intergenerational. So I really appreciate his work. And Brother Lawrence Freelo is the one that was able to put the intro to this show for chats, live views. And that wasn't an easy thing to do. And that's what you just saw before this show started. And by the way, there are a lot of pieces in that intro. You really don't know what they represent. And we're going to eventually put labels underneath, but I want to give you a little idea. There's a picture of me bending over and talking to a bald headed man. That's the president of Senegal, um, President Wad. And that was at the 2004 African Scholars Conference in Senegal, in which I was the only African from outside of Africa to chair a plenary, Pan-Africanism in the 21st Century. I was wondering why they flew me first class. I've only flown first class about 3 times in my life. I'm not wasting my money on first class. And I was only told that I chair this plenary about 10 minutes before I chaired it. And it was the ambassador from Senegal to South Africa that told me. He's somebody that I knew because he used to come to our headquarters, Malcolm X Unity House, when we did programs. We'd have 200-300 people and, do education and organizing. So that was me talking to the president of Senegal. And you'll see another where I'm sitting with a woman on the side of me. It's in color. That's me chairing that plenary. That was a big honor because the resolutions that came out of that plenary went to the African Union. And we had some interesting struggles around that. And you saw, and I'm not going through all these pictures, but you saw a black and white picture of 3 people sitting down. And you might have recognized me when I had Big Natural. And then on one side, if you noticed, profile was Amiri Baraka, formerly Leroy Jones. And on the other side, a brother called Owusu Sadakawe. And he had been former chair of the African Liberation Support Committee. This was at the 6th Pan-African Congress in 1973. And we were in the midst of a debate, revolutionary Pan-Africanism versus dogmatic Marxism. I thought Baraka was on my side because up to that point, he had been a follower of Maulana Karenga and was an Nguza Sabaite and was a Black nationalist and a cultural nationalist and leader in the Black arts movement. So I thought he was on my side, but he had flipped to extreme Maoism. So I'm debating 2 of them. And all I can say is I cleaned their clock. I taped that debate and I put it into a little pamphlet, a little booklet. Artists put me in there with the beret on. I usually don't wear one, with the 45 on my hip. And it says P.A.P.O, Pan-African People's Organization. I chaired the political committee of the 6th Pan-African Congress. So I'm not going through all those pictures. I'm just saying that intro has a lot of history to it. And we're going to eventually put labels underneath it so you know what it is, though sometimes it might be hard for you to see because it would flash on the screen real quick. In terms of improvements on the show, this is the main one we've been going after, is viewership. And we, for the last, 3, 4, 5 months, we've averaged an average viewership of this show of about 300 in the first week. And then it goes up after that. And this is a part of y'all dedicated viewers. And that means that by the end of the month, a good video will generate about 646 views. In the course of a year, if you're doing good, you might get 1,000. But then if we're dealing with someone like the brother that did the program on Malcolm X's assassination, that has generated 6,000 views and 140 odd comments, not one of them negative. That's because of the substance of that. And then there are others that have generated a little bit more than that. But on average, if you're doing 1,000 in a year, that's pretty good. But what's changed starting this week is extremely important. We have been simulcasting to Facebook and YouTube. And I have 4,600 Facebook friends, though I need Facebook followers. And I'll be making this point in a minute. And one reason we went to StreamYard is so we could simulcast on Facebook and YouTube at the same time. What's happened is this week, we've generated 1,000 viewers in 1 week. I told you that sometimes you're doing good to do that in a year. And that's because we upped the Facebook viewership while keeping the YouTube viewership, some of the Facebook viewership have also transferred to YouTube. That's an indication of something's changing, and that's for the good, but we're not settled with that. That's just a step. So one of the things I want to do to Facebook viewers, and my wife, who is a perennial Facebook viewer, she watches Facebook and feeds into Facebook except when she's going to sleep. She knows Facebook inside out. And she's been the best advisor I've had on this whole show, giving me all kinds of insights and stuff like that. So for Facebook, it's important, and I know some of you are on both Facebook and YouTube, it's important for Facebook viewers to click on to the Facebook icon that has me in a black crown, because there's a couple of them. But the one you want to click on if you're on Facebook is that icon that has me on a black crown with some African outfit on it. And what you then want to do is to click on following. And for all you are on Facebook, you know, a follower in Facebook is like a subscriber on YouTube, a little different, but that's basically what it is. And then when you hit into following, then click into favorites, Favorits, favorites. Click onto that. And then also click the logo that has highlights and live video. And when you do that, then you get the maximum access to Facebook viewing. And then, of course, post your videos. That's something that Brother Ogawa has advised and my wife has as well. So that follower under Facebook is important because it allows you to do other things. So do that. Now, I've been advised, and I know that a lot of Facebook viewers are into only the Facebook world. They won't go anywhere else. But for those of you that will, then also subscribe to YouTube, you know, because part of the point of simulcasting is to get YouTube viewers and later Instagram, and Ogawa succeeded already in Twitter, to get them to go to YouTube and subscribe. And that's extremely important. Now, the main improvement that we're looking for is hiring a person who specializes in recruiting subscribers. It's taken me a while to even know that that's what I had to do. And so I got some good advice. I've identified a firm, and either today or tomorrow, we should be signed up. And within a day, they start their recruiting. This costs money because for every viewer you get, then there's a charge. But it's worth it if they do a good job, because what's different about them in Google, when Google, you pay for ads, the problem with Google is they're just giving you viewers. But the thing about specialists on subscriptions is they are into identifying and profiling the types of people that watch this show or some other show. And then they zero in on that. And so there's a whole series of things that's done with that. And so we'll see within the next week what we're getting from that as a kickoff. I know that the big deal on any of these platforms is you got to hang in there, but you got to do the right stuff. Some people think it's just hanging in there. And then the most popular shows are gossip, BS shows. Not all, but the ones that go up quick, you know what I mean? A lot of off the top of your head talking about nothing. You know what I mean? So it's not as easy to build a substantive following, but we've got a nice group of people here, and I'm learning from you all and appreciate you, and we want to build it. The whole point of doing this is to transfer information intergenerationally. Now, brother Dreamchild asked me, what did I mean by younger? Because looking at me, he sees I'm as old as the pyramid. So somebody my age might consider 50 younger, which is his age, 52. And his wife's age, which is slightly less, you know what I mean? And so younger for me means young. But to be realistic, it probably starts around 30. And that's where our viewing audience starts, because that's generally when people have settled down and start to develop some serious thinking, you know. But I've been signing up Facebook friends who are 20, 21. And I know from the viewership on YouTube, we've got a lot of younger people. And that's the real point of this platform. We're interested in conversing with anybody, but it's especially young people. And so this is intergenerational transfer and also transfer of knowledge from people in my generation who have some serious stuff, as you saw with the Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party, Emory Douglas, and many others that we've had on this show. So this is the purpose of this platform. And then moving to the area of leadership training, this is one way we operationalize it so that a lot of this information for people that are really interested in revitalizing their families and communities, extended family communities, really empowering our people, not just in the US, but globally, then this is a platform for that as well. So much on the improvements, and there'll be others. A few news announcements, and then we get into the show. A lot of attention has been paid in the news media on Ukraine. Not much has been paid on why this war has occurred, and I'm not going into too much of the detail, except to say that Putin, I think, made a big mistake in thinking he could walk in and take the country. Russian speakers would run to him and all this kind of stuff. This really indicates he is surrounded by some people ain't giving him good advice. And so that was a big mistake. Invading, I think, was a mistake, though. He's going to make the best of a bad situation. But what hasn't been pointed out in the media is that the U.S. has provoked this with their warmongering policies, in this case, towards Russia. I'm not pro-Russian. I'm not pro-Putin. I'm just giving you facts, you know. And the fact is, when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics collapsed, Bush 1 promised that they would not expand NATO to the borders of Russia. They promised that they would not be pulling out former members of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics into NATO. And they did just the opposite. When Bill Clinton, a Republican in disguise, a neoliberalist, becomes president, he immediately ratchets things up. And then there's a whole issue in Ukraine of whether or not they would be a part of the European Union or not. And of course, the truth is, Russia wouldn't mind. Russia asked to be a part of NATO at the collapse of the USSR. The great ambition of the czars was to be a European power, even though they're Euro-Asian. Of course, that's what Europe is. It's really a part of the Asian continent. But in the case of Russia, it's got a lot of Asian characteristics, you know what I mean? As well as European. And it's Slavic. It's Eastern Aryan. And the Western Aryans or Western Europeans don't give 2 cents about them. You know what I mean? So I'm just saying as background, America helped provoke this by not pursuing policies that would have worked in their best interests. And those policies would have been to either leave Russia alone or absorb it. And that is, let them come in as members. You know what I mean? So Russia's got its fault. America's definitely got their fault. But the key point is this war in Ukraine has led to a ratcheting up of food prices, gas prices, a whole number of things, and food shortages. Since Ukraine is a major supplier of food, grains in the world, Africa is being affected. Over 350,000 Somalian children could starve to death if these grains are not released, something isn't done. You know what I mean? And there's a lot more implications for this internationally and domestically. So that's a little comment on the international thing. At the same time, while the U.S. has been slow to admit any large number of Ukrainians, and the Europeans they have opened this country up to Ukrainians. At the same time, since Biden has been in office, 20,000 Haitians have been deported back to Haiti. 20,000. And Biden is up talking about this ain't racist. Like hell if it isn't, you know? And even among the people who come into this country, whether from Mexico, South America, or wherever else, Cuba, the Haitians have been at the bottom of the list, a lot of them held in detention forever. And so they are being punished, obviously, for being Black, but being rebellious Blacks who led the only effective, successful slave rebellion in the history of the world. And they're being punished for it to this day. And so what you need to do is send letters to your president and tell him to back off of his racist policy, you know? And it's not funny, but one of the assignments given to his vice president, Kamala Harris, whose father comes from Jamaica, was to go to South America and tell them, don't come here, you know, stay in your countries and apply, but don't be making all these crossings and everything, you know? Wasn't that nice? Give a Black woman a part. That really didn't matter whether she was part of Jamaican or Caribbean heritage, but it just so happened that that's the case. Send her there to give that message. Wasn't that nice of you, Biden? You know what I mean? So that's some news. Just as a point for next week, we're going to have Emory Douglas on, a former Minister of Culture of Black Panther Party, and he's going to be doing a slide presentation, a PowerPoint presentation on his revolutionary art. And this brother is a wonderful human being, a revolutionary, has put out a lot for our people, and is a magnificent artist. A lot of people only see him on a cartoon level. He's a gifted portrait artist and is able to do symbolism in his portrait work. I have a painting here that he did of Malcolm that is a symbolic painting. He gave it to me on my birthday. I framed it, got a beautiful frame. I showed it to you a couple of weeks ago. And it's a symbolic picture. You got to be a good artist to do this, because he could capture Malcolm exactly in his likeness. But, you know, what he did was give you the symbolism of Malcolm, just absolutely beautiful. So we're going to get that treat. I also, coming from the Bay Area and having been born in San Francisco, this may be a revolutionary show, but I'm going to say, right on to the Warriors. Good for you kicking Boston, the Boston Celtics behind. And I know some people watching this show may be Celtic fans, but it was a wonderful sight to see them win their fourth ring. And one of the things that I really want to say about the Warriors, and this kind of ties into the topic for this show, is that they have brought another level of artistry to basketball and its expression of African American culture. And in this case, at its highest level, they have brought in the innovative game. They changed the whole way in which basketball is played through the long shot. And then over time, you saw people like Steph and others get inside the paint and get real good, do those funny layups, those twists and turns and all that kind of stuff, because he was smart enough to know that if you only rely on the three-pointer, you're going to live or die on it. That was Shaq's point when he was first commentating on this series. He said, you live by the three-pointer, you die by the three-pointer. You know what I mean? And so actually Boston was a lot of times doing better on 3 points than the Warriors, except when they cut loose. And it was like balls coming from the sky, sinking. And then for these new Warriors. So I've enjoyed the Warriors. And I have to admit, because my wife will get me on this if I'm not honest about it, I'm a summer warrior when it comes to sports. I'll watch sports when there's something to get out of it. It isn't just winning, but when I see beauty. And in the case of what the Warriors put forward, beautiful basketball. And then a nice team. And Steph Curry, you know, right on to you, brother. I'm 6'1". He's 6'2". That is small for a basketball player. I believe it's 6'2". But size ain't everything. You know what I mean? So my hat off to the Warriors. I know some people that are going to be downtown San Francisco shouting and everything else. I'm going to be watching it on TV. Now, the topic for today's show is an extension of last week's show that announced the launching of the P.A.P.O House of Life, Amilcar Cabral, Elder Baker Leadership Institute. Last week's show announced this as a leadership training program to be done on YouTube and other platforms on the internet. And I also noted that the first launching for this leadership training will be through the 6-fold stages to mental freedom that a number of people have signed up for. And I'll give you a count next week. As soon as we have 40, we'll be prepared to go on that. That's going to be a year-long training program. Two times a month, a couple hours each time, 2 or 3 hours each time. The reason for that is that this is one of the methods that's used in this show for transmitting knowledge or wisdom through transformation. And so the 6-fold stages to mental freedom is a system devised by myself and Bulelelu Wabogo, or I should say discovered by us, that marks the stages of awakening when Black folks and people of color are wakening up from the various forms of brainwashing we undergo, and we've charted the cycles. It marks my own experience in transformation, Malcolm's, Amilcar Cabral, the brother I worked with on this, Bulelelu Wabogo, was using Frantz Fanon to chart this. So this system of transmitting information, knowledge, and wisdom isn't just for the the basis of just having information. It's for the basis of transformation. And so identity transformation is very important. I don't know if you watched the show that was done on the Woze from Sacramento. And this was on the twin lineal families. And one brother was talking about he's in his late 60s and just waking up. Now that sounds like it's late, but I felt the same way when I was 23 and waking up. And I suppose people who are younger will feel the same way, because you're supposed to be born awake. But when you're in a society that's got everything lined up to close your eyes, waking up's a big deal. You know what I mean? The comics make fun of it now, call it woke culture, but of course, this is different. This is some systematic stuff in terms of the development of consciousness, African, new African, and if you want, Black consciousness. So when we kick that off, that is the inauguration of the P.A.P.O Institute. And so the real point of this is, on the surface, it's appeared in Black liberation movements that our leadership has developed haphazardly because there usually haven't been formal institutes for training, except I mentioned the Highlander and a few others. But in fact, there have been systems out there, often unidentified, but out there. And so the sixfold stages to mental freedom, that's an organic system that we experience as we're engaged in struggle or any kind of change in life where we're trying to serve a cause higher than ourselves. And it's organic because if you pursue it consistently, you're going to find yourself going through stages. And it's global. So an Amilcar Cabral, who's in the back there with the sunglasses, he went through the same stages of awakening that I went through, or that Malcolm X went through, or any of a number of others did. And so while there was no formal thing, no one told me that when I began to get my eyes awakened by my vice chair, Norman Brown, over some chicken at Virginia's restaurant, no one told me, well, you're embarked on a journey. And Norman didn't know it, and it didn't know for 20 years. I told him 20 years later, oh, by the way, you woke me up. You know? So it's not like that without formal leadership training, there's no process. There is, but it depends on how deep people go into it, how deep they pursue the truth. So that's key. And the same thing with developing mastery. Seth Curry in basketball, the brother that took my place at San Francisco State, Dr. Siri McDougal, was talking to me earlier this week, and he was talking about Mike Tyson. And he's heard me talk about the mastery system that comes out of Africa that African Americans carried here. And he was saying, oh, that's just like what you said. Mike Tyson was describing how I became a master in boxing. The only way you're going to become a master is to go through masters. And I want to say the only way. If you think you can make it up, try it. Take a boxer and let them just go out there and just knock people out on the street or get in the ring and just throw punches. You understand? There's a whole process. There's a whole training system. And then there's the review of masters. And without Sugar Ray Robinson, Muhammad Ali wouldn't have had his style. He apprenticed under Sugar Ray Robinson. So this P.A.P.O Leadership Training Institute is systematizing this stuff. It's drawing from this stuff, but it only works if people are engaged in struggle and undergo this, and it's a voluntary system. It's nothing that anybody can force you to do. It's your choice. And everybody doesn't want to be the best at something. You know, what a shame. Doesn't mean you'll be the best. The main thing is to be your best, but not to try and be excellent. And what you do is to defy your own culture, because this is a culture of excellence. African culture, African American, or what I call New African culture, it's a culture of excellence, founded on excellent character, and then the excellence in the way we carry ourselves in our lives. So last week I was pointing out the grounding for the P.A.P.O system in Kemet, the highest educational system, P.A.P.O, the highest educational system or House of Life system, highest university system, and the classless age grade societies of Africa, which people like Ella Baker and Amilcar Cabral drew from. And they are a part of the example of how this system is an adaptation of ancient systems to modern times. So the topic for today is creative Black leadership and expression of their popular culture. Today, I want to focus on the role in which popular culture, African and African American, plays in terms of leadership development, in terms of movements for liberation, in terms of the degree to which they're successful and the degree to which they are not. And it plays the role in which culture plays in that is heavy. Amilcar Cabral correctly asserted that you measure the chance for a liberation movement being successful by the difference between the culture of the oppressed and the culture of the oppressor. To the degree to which the culture of the oppressed is at a higher level, to that degree is a different, qualitatively superior, and provides guidance for a struggle for liberation. And to the degree that you're embracing your enemy's culture, then of course you might not even have the desire to struggle for freedom, struggle for liberation. You might be satisfied being on a mental plantation, psychologically incarcerated, mentally lynched, may not even know that somebody else has got your brain and is dribbling it right down the basketball court. When you're thinking somebody else's thoughts and you think they're your own, you're in a world of trouble, So this show is going to focus on the popular culture, and it's going to focus on the fact that one of the biggest problems for African people coming out of enslavement in the U.S., in the Western Hemisphere, wherever we were in the world enslaved, but particularly for the African in America, biggest problem coming out of enslavement is that on the one hand, we wanted to forget what we had gone through in enslavement. That was true for Africans around the world and generally true of oppressed people. Japanese were in concentration camps, didn't want to talk about it. Jews that went through the concentration experience didn't want to talk about it. And it's understandable because it was a savage experience. But very often we threw the baby out with the bathwater. And in not talking about it, many of us, most of us in this country, found ourselves in a position to this day where to this day we have not assessed this rich culture that was recreated in the bowels of enslavement, because we've associated everything with slavery with shame, and then we bought into the myths that we lost our culture anyway, so why should we study it? There's nothing to study anyway. So some of our most prominent intellectuals, and I'm talking here about nationalists, who talk about culture and the role of culture, may come up with their own ideas about what the culture should be, but have not interrogated African American or New African culture. Some have. Zora Neale Hurston, who I've mentioned many times before, has, and a number of others, but they're in a minority. And the Afrocentric scholars, which I'm a part of, most often are focused exclusively on Africa and have limited knowledge of African American culture. James Small is an exception. That's one reason why we're so close, because we share common views. And of course, it's natural for him coming out of South Carolina. You hear me? That brother's bad. I really love old James Smalls. In fact, I don't know how somebody with all that big wisdom has the last name Smalls. It's kind of funny. That's my buddy. I really love James Smalls. We're good friends. So he doesn't make that mistake. He can't. He was up there in that church on the Wayland bench. He knows that there's something different in the black church than the white church. But a lot of you all Afrocentrists, black nationalists, Pan-Africanists, that's the first thing you want to put down. Some of my best friends put this down. You understand? And I tell them straight up, you don't know what you're talking about. You do not know what you're talking about. Because one of my specialties, by the way, I'm a historian, philosopher, political activist, thinker. 3 areas, and a bunch of things underneath that. Then I have 3 specialties up underneath that: African-American music, the African-American family, and the black church. Those are all specialties. Why? Because that's the heart and soul of our people. And then underneath that is African-American culture or new African culture. I spend as much time studying us here as the African on the continent. I love both. But as I've told you before, I got a special love for the muddy waters and muddy water. You understand? The muddy waters, which is the blues, baby, huh? And the blues people. But Muddy Water, you know, who is one of the greatest blues musicians ever, but many others as well. So, big mistake if you're going to know the root but not the fruit. Big mistake. You hear me? And then to come up with all this psychological damage that you imagine happened in slavery that didn't happen, and a lot did. I don't underestimate it, but we carry it too far. Those Africans who underwent enslavement, that was the roughest, toughest, most regal, royal group of Africans in our history. You hear me? The baddest ones, bad as in good. You hear me? And it's everyday black folks that created this culture, grassroots black folks. My friend, Catherine John, Dr. Catherine John, who comes from Jamaica but was raised here, but is very Jamaican, she makes the point that in Jamaica, the culture comes from the dirt. Here we call it the grassroots. And so this magnificent culture that we shaped was shaped by everyday black people. Read Carter G. Woodson's Miseducation of the Negro. And who's he talking about with the miseducated Negro? Mainly college-educated black. That does not mean that blacks who have less than a college education are all conscious and all black-minded and everything else. No, it doesn't mean that. But it means that they're the closest to Africa to this day. And here's the other contradiction. In most cases, don't even know it. And we'll be the first ones to tell you they ain't no African. And more African than some of the Africans in the motherland. You hear me? And that ain't just here. If you go to the Caribbean, the same thing. Mom, I ain't no African. I'm a Jamaican. I'm a Barbadian. Get mad at you on that. And then what have they got? 3 wives. 1 on the inside, 2 on the outside. What is that? That's polygamy, baby. It's just frowned on because you come up under colonialism and slavery. So they told you that's sinful. But it's okay to be married and play around, but to have 3 women that you call wives, but because it's not legal, because you're coming up under monogamy and Christianity, so 1's inside, 2 are outside, and the brother's trying to get them 3 or 4 more. And the first thing the average black man in this country, when he gets conscious, wants to do, not all, but too many, is get him another wife. One of my best friends, I won't name his name on the show, but a former student of mine, he'll be doing training on this show, helping me in training. I've been working with him for 50 years. He went home to his wife one day and said he'd like to have another wife. They've been married for I don't know how many years. They got 2 children. They've gone through our school, blah, blah. Very conscious man and woman. And for a minute, he thought he was in heaven. She said, yeah. He goes, oh. And then she said, without me. And that was the end of that. You hear me? So we were running around here, know a lot about Kemet, those of us that are Afrocentric, but not enough about Afro-America. And too often, some of my conscious brothers and sisters who come from the Caribbean, who are equally Afrocentric, coming out of Jamaica and various other islands, living in Europe or somewhere else because it's hard to earn a living in these islands, you know, they're coming out of a Jamaican culture and they have some pride of coming from Jamaica, but you don't hear them talking too much about Jamaican culture, too much about Jamaican roots. They know something about it, but it isn't placed high on the value list. You know what I mean? Big mistake, you know? So one of our biggest weaknesses is we haven't assessed this culture. Yet culture's in you. So whether you assess it or not, you're living it. And so we've left our children with the assumption that they don't have one. And most of the time when I'm speaking to younger people, and I'm talking about young people, teenagers, 20, 21, I ask them, how many of you think you have a culture? Hardly no hands come up. You know, an African culture, or African-American, no hands go up. How many think we don't? Almost all of them go up. You hear me? And the only way a people don't have a culture is through genocide. Your culture ceases to exist when the people cease to exist. As long as the people exist, culture will continue to exist. This is true for all people, but especially for people who have the oldest culture in the history of the world, 144,000 years ago, give or take 10,000 years, according to mitochondrial DNA, or 200,000 according to other bone fragments and other evidence. And this is in your cellular memory. And so you have deep down inside of you embedded culture, subliminal, and then also conscious, you know? So we operate on this assumption, and too many of our scholars have fed us with this, that it is half true, that African culture was destroyed in America. Now, there's half truth in this, because there is the truth that certain vestiges of African culture couldn't survive. Here, kingship. Even though the concept of it survived in some Caribbean islands, there were a couple of major slave revolts planned in Barbados where Sante people were planning the rebellion to restore their kingship, meaning some of those people came from royal line, you know? And so in the Caribbean, you have some of that. And then maroon communities, both in the Caribbean and here, where you would escape, go into the mountains, or in the case of Louisiana, into the swamps or whatever, and form your own communities. And many of these communities, especially maroon communities in the Caribbean, were formed on African principles. And you had kings, and, you know, sometimes they're called chiefs by the Europeans, but they're kings and queens and stuff like that. But in most cases, kingship and queenship couldn't survive simply because you're under this enslavement system. But principles of that did survive. And we'll talk about that as we go on in terms of leadership and leadership traditions. Lineage couldn't survive because you were not bringing in whole family groups. And lineages are large extensions of bloodlines, African bloodlines, and clans, which are even larger family units. They couldn't continue. But a brother who wrote the book Exchanging Country Marks, he makes the point that in the US, contrary to popular opinion, Africans were not all separated from their ethnic groups, because Africans were brought into places like South Carolina, Louisiana, and other places because they had particular skills, rice growing skills, for example. And so that meant the Senegambian region would bring in or be the place from which a lot of Africans were brought. And so that means people from the same cultural group in the same places. And then in America, the majority of plantations we're enslaved on were large plantations, not small, contrary to popular opinion. So that gave you a greater field for transmitting culture. But still, intact language system generally couldn't survive. Notice I said intact. And there were other formal systems that didn't survive. But then on the other hand, extended family community systems survived. You understand? In the case of linguistics, while the formal speaking of the Yoruba, Asante, or other African languages didn't survive, what we have is that, first of all, because of the way in which culture is transmitted, which is something that comes out of the deep structure of a people, comes out of their inner spirit, their inner soul, then they're carrying things. And the first couple of generations are carrying them directly. And then those get transformed over a period of time. And so the soul is carrying a whole lot. The spirit is carrying a whole lot. The heart is carrying a whole lot. And the essence of what comes out of what becomes the new African cultural creation is a whole lot of beauty. And that beauty is African based. And that's what enables you to sustain yourself and survive. And one thing I'd say about the African American is the African American is made up of a whole bunch of artists. I mean, the African American has an artistic quality about him and her. And I'm not saying that's not true of other Africans in the world, but in this country, that's especially true. And so what you're drawing from your souls is an African essence that is your inspiration, and it at its heart is beautiful. That is the thing. And that's what could sustain us and lead us to come out of enslavement with our humanity intact, with inner beauty, with scars, with issues. You hear me? But inner beauty, this is the side that's missed. And that inner beauty was expressed through caring for others. I hear a lot of our scholars talking about, well, we need to define our humanism. Oh, really? Yeah, okay. I got one word for it: kindness. You hear me? And the first generations were kind and rough, but they give you the last nickel, the last penny to help you out. That was the core of it. That was a part of their African essence. So as this culture was attacked, we go inside ourselves and recreate it. That was a requirement more difficult for us than the Caribbean, because 98% of the people on an island were African. So really couldn't be any wholesale attack on it, the culture, because it wasn't a settler colony they were living in. You know, whites were not the majority, though in the case of the South during enslavement, there were areas of the South where blacks were the majority. South Carolina, for example, that's where you had the most heavy, serious rebellions. As my wife would point out, a significant number of Barbadians there, you know. So while on the surface, there are formal aspects of African culture that couldn't survive, the key thing is that core elements did. And then were transformed into this setting. So what the African American did was draw from the fundamental principles of African culture, come up with new ones suited for this reality, and then have to deal with the imposition of the mess imposed by enslavement. And those are still issues we have to deal with today, some of which I'm going to be addressing, you know. So the mantra of the new African, and you see it, I've said this before about George Washington Carver, what he would say about what he was doing with botany, what the musicians always say they're doing with music, what our people say generally when they are trying to bring something into the world that will inspire people is they say they're bringing beauty where there is ugliness. And that's essentially what this process was, going inside your souls and drawing on your African essence. And if you want to look at the core of that, and this is the core of African and African American leadership traditions, but it's the core of the culture in general. The essence of hunter-gatherer societies, the essence of these societies without kings and queens, the essence of societies with kings and queens. What was it? Freedom. You hear me? Freedom. The African came in with this free spirit. And as I said before, and I played it on one of the shows, I had a birthday party, I think it was my 80th, and a sister named Carol Stallings sang the song. It's on my first show. If you look at all the shows called Free the Mind, she sang the mantra song for the enslaved African. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. I've made reference to this before. But the fact is, that's your mantra. And that's a mantra that would normally not be sung by people who are enslaved, because they were not enslaved in mind or spirit. And they rejected the chains around their body. That was the attitude of most enslaved blacks. You hear me? And they were drawing from this cardinal principle of freedom. But then to show you how this new African culture is recreated in this setting, and we take old principles and we transform them in a new setting, so we come up with the new African definition of freedom. That freedom is based on discipline. No freedom without discipline. A Malcolm X wouldn't be the person that we look up to today had he not pursued the discipline to free his mind. You hear me? In basketball, Kobe Bryant came in with a lot of talent, but there were a number of other players that came in as he did. But the difference is the discipline. The discipline. I've always said in life, the two key things is good character and discipline. Now, don't get me wrong. A person with bad character and discipline is dangerous. And if you got good character and you're lazy, they're going to run right over you. Might anyway. Because just don't think you're right. You're going to win a fight. But that's the key to victory. You know, standing on what's right and working hard. So when Frederick Douglass talked about freedom having to do with the mighty roar of the oceans, that the price of freedom is struggle, that's the new African twist on this African conception of freedom. And then, and this is, of course, the mantra of the African in America, it is the ethos of the African in America. Discipline and freedom is the basis for improvisation or spontaneous organization, to quote Dizzy Gillespie. Creating on the spot. That's us. But we didn't recreate a culture on the spot out of nothing. We drew from a deep well, and then we suited it to this environment, to this reality. So the African in America is by nature tuned to this, not to do the same thing the same way twice. That is good battle strategy. That is good leadership strategy. That is good parenting strategy. That is good strategy for any area of life, because life is constant change. Everything must change. Nothing remains the same. The young become the old. Mysteries, they do unfold. This culture that we haven't bothered to study, except for a few, is a global culture, the popular culture of choice of the world, and the classical culture of the world, jazz. You hear me? Why? It's beautiful. It's based on freedom. You can express yourself in your own way. If it's hip hop, then you can adapt that to your reality and speak to it you know, but it is also situational. So it's speaking to the changing situations of life. That's why Ella Baker was a situational revolutionary. She offered guidance in situations for how to free yourself, as opposed to the laundry A to Z list that a European thinker would do. And we also do systematic stuff too, and she did. But the fact is, a culture that is suitable for life situations is practical. It can be used on a day-to-day basis, and it's inspiring, and it can pick you up anywhere you are in the world, turn you around, and as the song would say, take you to higher ground. You hear me? So this is a part of how we took the Africa inside of us and spun it in a new environment. And then, of course, I've talked about the spiritual blues before. A somber, sad, joyous music that takes the twin mindset of Africa and translates it into this reality. So it's not one way. It's not all sad. It couldn't be all optimistic. And it's that mindset that has kept our suicide rates at a lower rate than anyone else's, though it's going up because some of us are going out of our minds and we're stepping out of our culture. And I'm not putting people down who are. Forces have caused this. And the youth have been caught in the middle of this. And the younger they are, the more caught they are in it. So this is part of how we took the spirit of Africa that's inside of us, transposed it into a new setting, and created something that's some of the most beautiful stuff on this planet Earth. So one of the things that enabled us to survive, I've mentioned this before, in enslavement, is that our ancestors, for periods of time, lived outside of time and space, meaning they were in the spirit realm. They were in the dream realm. They were in various other realms where they could go to another place. That's the realm of God, outside of time, outside of space. And I know when God hears the most beautiful expressions of this culture, God, which is infinite force, not man or woman. I don't want to say force can sit up, but I will. That mighty force, that beautiful light sits up and becomes brighter. It's fed by the beauty of Black folks. How are you going to have beauty like this going through the hell you went through? Because you're some of the strongest people on the planet Earth. And I'm saying this for all Africans. But for this African in America, what you went through, to come through was something that could inspire humanity, just as the Afro-Haitians could come through and come up with the banner of freedom, produced through blows, through bloodshed, could wipe out one of the strongest armies at that time, Napoleon's army, clean the clock of his brother-in-law, Leclerc, who came in with the big army, then had to get reinforced because the first one was being wiped out by Africans and, by disease. And this was done by soldiers who didn't go to no West Point, who didn't go to no military academy. Their academy was inside their souls. You hear me? It was inside the repositories of their culture, and in this case, voodoo, which is the whole thing, African spirit systems, a mixture of Dahomean, Yoruba, S.N.C.C, and others, and then P.A.P.O, the Indian spirit systems. When you put those forward, you had something bad. You hear me? And so, again, this new African culture, and this is true in the Caribbean and South America as well, but here, so the language, you could no longer speak the language of the Yoruba, the S.N.C.C, except for a few places. For the most part, you couldn't. But what will we come up with? What our Black linguists call Ebonics, which is nothing more than the Niger-Congo Bantu linguistic system, which 85% of Black people speak. And the school system has done everything to wipe out. You hear me? That is your African heritage. And so it's no accident that when the younger generation, younger then, is faced with the attack on rhythm and blues, they come up with hip hop, word up, the word. And then they start adding their own expressions to it. You know, dope. Huh? The African-based linguistic family and system is based on the new African one in the Caribbean and the US is based on African linguistics. And what does Dr. Jacob Carruthers tell us about that in his book, Merunecha? A little tiny book, 120 pages. That was my master there, Jake. He's in heaven now. Hello, Jake. Hope you're checking this out, you know. He described Merunecha, which is God speak, and then Merunefer, human speak, as the walking, talking, doing language. Now, how does the African in America and the Caribbean, South America, take this African linguistic pattern? We turn it into high drama, walking, talking, dancing, prancing, signifying language. Preached in the church, rapped on the stage, played through the saxophone or the trumpet or whatever it is, because the average musician who's playing a musical instrument reproduces through the instrument the human voice. So it walks and it talks. You hear me? And it dramatizes every area of life. Of course, we associate drama with the negative because, you know, drama, we say drama, we're talking about screaming and hollering, going off. Nah, we're talking about how every part of life is a beautiful occasion, and we associate drama to it. The Black person's walk is dramatic, male or female. Wade Nobles and I were in the bus. We're in Senegal in 2004 African Scholars Conference, and Wade was looking out the window and he says, "Look at those Africans. They don't walk, they strut." Same way my grandmother did. You understand? That is your conversation in how you walk. It says something, you know? So every part of Black life has got that. From your nose to your toes, to your hips, to your thoughts and your dreams. New African speech and New African life itself is dramatic by nature. And one of the things we find as the linguistic pattern is taken from Africa, formal language, and then translated into this Black speak, Ebonics, Niger-Congo Bantu speech pattern that prevails not only here, but in the Western Hemisphere, and even a more pure form in the Western Hemisphere. We find this language is full of drama and action. And it's why? And it's verbal. Why? Because it's based on doing. And this is because in the language, thinking and doing are inseparable. In other words, you have to be those truths. It isn't just talking about it. It isn't just intellectualizing. So, as I pointed out before, the mantra in ancient Kemet, speak truth, do truth. General mantra in Africa is to know the truth, is to be the truth. So in this leadership training process, but in our life process in general, it's not enough to talk a truth. You got to walk the truth. And if you don't walk the truth, then your speech is crooked. It's not respected. It's hollow. And this goes back to African traditions, but this is going back to the essence of what it means to be African and how we translate it into this world setting. So truth isn't just a talk, truth is a walk. So African leadership systems are grounded in this, living the truth, knowing the truth, speaking the truth. This all requires the transformation of mind, body, and spirit. And without that, this is not true knowledge. You know what I mean? This is surface knowledge. This is white knowledge. And this is why Carter G. Woodson wrote Miseducation of the Negro, saying one thing and doing another. Talking black and doing white, you know? So what we see then is this regality, which is a part of this dramatic spirit, is expressed in the nobility of the character of our people. Not all, but too many, who haven't got a penny sometimes and behave like they're kings and queens, because they are. Because they're the owners of not only their own spirit, but if they embody the truth of a life force that anyone's got any sense of better respect, but that they do themselves. And so at the midnight of enslavement, you had some of the most royal people undergoing this savage system, some of the most royal thinking, feeling, and acting people. So one of the things we see when we study African American culture, and I'm just hitting the surface, a few points to get into this discussion of the topic, creative Black leadership and expression of their popular culture. What is it that they're drawn from? And if they don't draw from it, what's the consequences? That's going to be part of what I'm dealing with here. So part of what we do as a people, when we come into a setting where our culture is attacked and everything else, we're viewing this in an African frame of mind, which we still have. We often don't recognize it. And that's a hieroglyphic frame of mind. You could call it Medu Neter, it would be more popular, but or more correct, but hieroglyphic. The African who's coming into this situation, the African to this day thinks hieroglyphically, thinks in terms of action. And often their thought is inspired by their dreams. I've talked to rappers who talk about some of their best rapping comes from their dreams. You understand? What are dreams? Pictures. And where do they come from? When they're real, because some people's dreams, they don't go anywhere, but then the higher ones are coming from God. They're coming from a heavenly plane. So that's a higher power of thought that you're drawn from. That's the thought that Sitting Bull drew from when he's framing the battle plan that did end Custer. Came through a dream. Sitting Bull was a warrior priest, chief. You hear me? That's some powerful stuff. When God gives you the answer, just execute it right, brother, sister. It's going to work. And imagine God giving you advice on how to kill somebody. Well, yeah, not really. It's how to preserve your life. That's what God has given you. So this culture that the African created here, it's true in the Caribbean as well. And of course, it comes from Africa, is hieroglyphic from root to fruit. You hear me? Like when you saw Steph Curry just before the victory, he's holding up 4 fingers. That's 4 rings pointing to each one of them. And this is just before the game is over. And this is a guy who comes off as humble. His coach said, no, don't fall for that. But he's a nice guy, Southern based. That's where the most African part of our culture comes from. Got all kinds of contradictions there too. You know what I mean? Coming straight out of the plantation, positive and negative. But Steph has got that low-key appearance. but he's the one that's working out hardest. He practices after a game. Who's got energy after a game? And with that frame of his, he's constantly muscling up so that he can do better, given the fact that he's getting older, but he's also smaller, going up against these bigger guys. But the point is that when you're looking at Steph Curry, you know what I mean? In his drama, which is low-key usually, he's expressing truths of life. And then with new basketball, now that's some real hieroglyphic expression. Sinking shots from nowhere. Oh my goodness. So at the end of enslavement, blacks thought that they were making progress when they turned their backs on this rich culture. Not all of them. I want to say this. The majority of the grassroots didn't turn their back on this culture. I want to say this too. Get this straight. Because they went on what they liked. They liked that stuff. They weren't intellectualizing it, but this is what they wanted. But too many of us turned our backs on this. And so Dizzy Gillespie, one of our greatest musicians and innovator of two fields of jazz, bebop, and then the Afro-Cuban beat, bringing it into jazz. Mario Posa, drawing on that. This is the most complex innovation in music in the 20th century, along with Dizzy Gillespie and Bird and Monk. These were the main innovators of this. Saxophone, trumpet, piano. Now, for years, Dizzy Gillespie, and this is common, not just for the musicians, it's just common across the field, whatever it is, he refused to play the blues. Why? Because it was associated with slavery. You know what I mean? He comes out of the South, man. You know what I mean? But that changed when he teamed up with Bird, Charlie Parker. You hear me? And when he started hearing that sweet sound coming off that alto saxophone, and he realized that Bird was dripping in the blues. You hear me? And that was the beauty. I'm going to say this. Jazz without the blues is empty because it's the foundation for the blues. Just like the blues without the spirituals can't be, because one is the other. You hear me? And so it's the beauty of this sound, the complexity of it, because it's not one way. It's cut in a lot of different ways. It's from this that the most creative, improvisational, innovative sounds that have ever been heard have been played. It's kind of like a mixture of grits and gravy, cornbread and chicken. You understand? Charlie Parker was called Bird, technically because while they were driving, they ran over a chicken, and then saved it and cooked it. You know what I mean? But actually, it had more meaning than that. Bird. You hear me? When he played that saxophone, birds would prick up. You hear me? He lent beauty to jazz that is on a plane of the bluebird. We have them out here. Every now and then I get to see a bluebird. And it's the male one with its crown that is most regal. And you see him hopping. It's almost like a strut. It's a beautiful thing to see. And then, of course, if you hear the chirping sound of the bird, period, beautiful to hear. But what was the key to Bird? He was born with gifts. As Dizzy said, some of us come into the world with very little and we have to work hard, and others come in with a lot and don't have to work much at all. Charlie Parker was in the second category. But the thing is, he'd have been nothing without the blues. You hear me? That's his groundation, his foundation. And so that was the down home foundation for the art form. So what does this have to do with leadership development? What does this have to do with shaping creative leadership? To shape or develop creative leadership, which is a process, it's a process you undergo. It's like any life process, through struggle, through various kinds of movements, through transformation and change, through engaging your enemy on a battlefield, a host of things. The key in terms of shaping creative leadership is really based on the degree to which that leadership draws on the depths of their popular culture. When I say popular culture, that we forged here, the classical culture that comes out of that, and then, of course, drawing from the deepest roots of the culture, its foundation in Africa. But particularly, and remember, what we're drawing from Africa was the popular culture of its day, and still is in many parts of Africa. And so the creativity of leadership is measured by how deep in the waters of African and especially new African culture those who are in this position swim. But this is true in all areas of life, not just leadership. Sports, music, science, I don't care what the area is, whatever your gifts are. So you've got to dip into the water. You've got to wade into the water. You got to swim into the water of African culture. And out of this can emerge beautiful thoughts, beautiful people that can combat and provide an alternative to the oppressive thoughts of this system. So I'm going to focus on Marcus Mosiah Garvey, him, because of the role he plays in terms of setting a leadership pattern for the 20th century. I pointed out before, my first master was Marcus Garvey. Now you'd say, how could he be your master? I was born in 1939. He died in 1940. You can, under the African and African-American apprenticeship system, especially given modern technology, you can apprentice under masters who are alive or masters who have passed on. Or you can have a direct apprenticeship under a living master while most of the time being away from them, because that's the nature of apprenticeship if you're in a society that's large. Technology will help you. You've got books that you can read that they may have written, or in the case of Malcolm, his speeches, and the same with Garvey. And not much on his speeches, but we have some. And then his books, Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, Volume 1 and Volume 2, and the writing of his wife, A Garvey and Garveyism, which I communicated with her. One of these days I'll share the letter that she sent me a number of years ago. So Garvey was my first master. And the reason I drew on Garvey was because coming out of what at that time I didn't know was the only successful Northern freedom movement, I just knew we were successful. We cleaned all clocks, kicked all corporate behinds and others, But in the midst of that, we're in the middle of battles, so those records hadn't really been accumulated. And I'm undergoing an awakening. And this is the sixfold stages to mental freedom. And at that same time, the book on Garvey comes out, Black Moses, by a white guy named Cronin. That book now, put in perspective, isn't that great a book? But at that time, it was great because for people like me, we knew nothing about Garvey. As I pointed out before, Kwame Ture did. He comes out of Trinidad, Stokely Carmichael. He was living in New York, where you were seeing ex-Garveyites, Queen Mother Moore, up on a stepladder preaching and stuff. So you'd know about it. But the average person in the Black Freedom Movement hadn't heard of Garvey, the average one. And so when I read about Garvey, I realize he's got some skills that I don't have. And at that same time, I'm undergoing a transformation of consciousness. And so I'm reading my history, reading my culture, same time engaging in battles. And so one of the key things that I drew from Garvey, as I pointed out before, is institution building. Now, you would think it would be the Nation of Islam because Elijah Muhammad had been a corporal in the Garvey movement. They were building businesses and stuff. But I saw the Garvey movement as doing that on a bigger stage. And it was just a lot to learn. And then my family's pretty good, particularly my mother and my brother, when it comes to economic development. And I got it in my bloodstream. I'm a good economic developer. But in part, it comes from learning from Garvey, you know, apprenticed at his feet. I've told the story before. I was in New York going to Central Committee meetings for the Congress of Racial Equality. And I would go by the same bookstore that Malcolm went to, Michelle's bookstore. And it was a bookstore that had so many books that there wasn't room on the shelves for books. They were just stacked up almost to the ceiling. And Malcolm would fall asleep in that bookstore reading books. That was his university in the community. And I would go by Mr. Michelle's bookstore each time I was in Harlem and ask him, "You have Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey?" And finally, he told me he did. I've told this before, but a lot of you haven't heard it. $100 in this is around 1963, 1964, I remember the exact year, was a lot of money. You could buy a Victorian for 5,800 square foot Victorian. It was $36,000. In fact, I bought one for our organization. $36,000. So think what 100 was. I was only, at that time, I was a full-time organizer making no money. So I said, hold the book. I gave him a small amount for a deposit and then got it. And that's one of my most treasured books I have. It's put in a place where you can't, the sun can't hit it. Nobody is allowed to pick that book up. It's got a little plastic cover on it. Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. You hear me? So I picked Garvey, and I'm using him as an example of how, on the one hand, good leadership is an expression of the best features of African American, African Caribbean, African popular culture, particularly African Caribbean, African American. But I'm also using it to illustrate what are the consequences when leadership is not always drawing from those positive features of African popular culture, as well as the features of African culture. And I should say, one of the things that distinguishes Garvey is his father had a great library, and Garvey read. He was self-educated. And when he traveled to Europe and went to Britain, he studied in the great libraries in Britain. And I know for a fact, because I read just about everything on Garvey, that one of the books he checked out of the British library was the largest one in Britain, was Edward Wilmot Blyden's book, African Life and Customs. Most important, insightful book written by an African in the 19th century on traditional African culture. Most people know about Christianity, Islam, and the Negro, but it's Africa Life and Customs that is the most important, a very small book. Unfortunately, Garvey didn't internalize that, and I'll come to that later, So Garvey is being used here as an example of how when our leadership is creative, it's drawing from the popular culture. And one of the examples is that he had to be doing something good because he's the best organizer produced by Blacks, at least in the Western Hemisphere, in the world. You hear me? In the world. Had the largest movement, far-flung, based in the United States, and this is real key, that he couldn't get it off in his own country, Jamaica. He got it off here, and then spreads to the Caribbean, South America, spreads to Africa, Europe, throughout the world. So the key reason that this movement had, and then had the impact on the Vietnamese Revolution, as I pointed out before, influencing Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Vietnamese Revolution. So the main reason that it had this impact is that it drew from the roots of African Caribbean and African American, or what I call New African popular culture. This is the key. Garveyism was a marriage between two streams. The Caribbean stream of nation statism, that is, the stream of culture coming from Africans where they're a majority on their islands, and at that time under British colonialism or British rule, but knew that a time would come where they could rule those islands. And so they had a vision that was nation state in its orientation in terms of the islands. And then both Africans in the Caribbean, Garvey from Jamaica, the African from the United States, had an all Africa or one Africa vision coming out of Ethiopianism, which was the main influence on Garvey. The passage in the Bible that says, "Princess shall come out of Egypt, Ethiopia, shall stretch forth its hand unto God soon." And that inspired Garvey. He never used the word Pan-African or one Africa, though he was the best embodiment of it. And the Rastafarians to this day, they draw from that. You know, Bob Marley, that beautiful sound. There's Africa all in it, but it's a new African sound, which is also a blending of Smokey Robinson. Because I got a thing when I was in Jamaica years ago, I got a recording of Bob Marley. It sounded, just like Smokey. And then he found his own voice. And then he electrified the planet. And Ethiopianism was key to that. Out of Ethiopianism, or this idea that one place on the planet Earth where Africans stood up, resisted colonialism, and remained free of it most of the time, except for a very short period of time. So Ethiopia became the symbol for the promise that one day all of Africa would be free. And so Garvey was inspired by that. So these were like roots for him. So the Garvey movement is a marriage of the nation state vision that we could rule ourselves, whether in an island or in Africa or the whole continent, which would be Pan-Africanism. And it was a marriage between that and the African-American conception, which I'll come into in a minute. So the UNIA was in many ways a government in exile, Universal Negro Improvement Association. It was a government in exile with Garvey as the provisional president of Africa. He copied that title from the title that the Irish head of Ireland had. His Liberty Hall was named after that. I know Tony Martin didn't like the fact that Tony Hill, who's done a lot of writing, both of them on Garvey, used that. Last time I saw him was in Senegal. He didn't like that reference, but it's true. It's true. But the key point is Garvey had this vision of a government. And so his organization was organized like a government in exile. And then he had an American leader who, according to John Henry Clark, was more impressive than Garvey, Eason, who was taller than him, erect, really looked good in a uniform. And he said, according to John Henry Clark, is a better speaker. I don't know. I haven't heard him. But if you heard Garvey in a recording, his speech went like a mile a minute. That was Garvey. He was a man on the move, you know what I mean? So his organization was organized like a government in exile. He had an African Legion. Of course, they didn't prance around with guns in their hands. They're too smart to do that. But the implication was there, that we can handle this. He had a Black Nurses Corps to heal the wounded in the case of battle. And he had an African Orthodox church, Bishop McGuire. And the most advanced Afrocentric thinking in the Garvey movement came out of the African Orthodox Church. So Garvey brought in this idea of nation state that we could rule ourselves, and then drew from the common idea that the African in America had of one Africa, because we gave birth to that here, and particularly the African in the Caribbean, Trinidad. These are the two streams that give birth to formally Pan-Africanism. Now, so Garveyism is a marriage between two streams. The Caribbean idea that you could rule yourself, and the African American idea of race consciousness. It's the merger of these two that enabled the Garvey movement to take off and electrify the world. And of course, you weren't going to get to the African in America unless you got into the African cultural mindset. So I pointed this out before. Most scholars on Garvey don't know this, because you have to really read Tony Hill's volumes on the Universal Negro Improvement Association. There are volumes of them. I've read 6 of them. There are many more. And you just read them, because it's about the Garvey movement in different parts of the world, because Garvey's impact was global. And so Garvey, as I pointed out before, was on the verge of leaving the United States because he couldn't get a following. He'd have a group and then it would fall apart and whatnot. In order for Garvey to build a movement in the United States, he had to undergo a conversion of consciousness to race consciousness. That wasn't something he needed in Jamaica, because in Jamaica, you're not being, lynched 24/7. You haven't got white people in your face all the time. It's a more nice colonialism, telling you to go to hell nicely. And as one Jamaican sister said, getting you to look forward to the trip. The British have terms when they oppress you that sound real nice, and you'll be fooled, you race conscious blacks, when you go to in Europe, you might have some white person help you with something. You're going to, especially sisters, likely to pass out. Well, a white person's reaching for anything next to you now, it ain't going to be to help you. But you missed the point. There ain't as many of you in the UK and in France and in other places, so they don't feel as threatened. You know what I mean? Plus, they have the veneer of the aristocracy, so there's this dripping arrogance and stuff. So, they'll give you the hello and the polite smile, and then kill you with a smile. You hear me? They're still out to kill you. So for Garvey to get his movement off the ground, this isn't anything he planned, but he had to undergo a conversion to embrace the new African cultural principle of race consciousness. And it's when he attends a meeting in Harlem where he sees that there's a new Negro. This was the term. King called the people in the Montgomery bus boycott new Negro, people who were free of fear, who were standing up and willing to fight. And what he finds as he attends a series of meetings organized by Hubert Harrison, a group called the Liberty League, he finds that there's a spirit among the African American he hadn't touched before. It was a race-conscious, anti-war, anti-Klan, self-defense, we won't take any mess spirit. And these were many blacks who had gone to Europe and fought in World War I and come back angry because they're facing bloody summers. They had been promised by their leaders that they fought this war, that things would be better, and they were catching hell. So they were angry at the old guard, the NAACP, W.B. Du Bois, and others. So Garvey's able to take off the ground with his movement because he embraces the militant, positive aspects of new African popular culture, the resistance aspects, the anti-imperialist aspects. And so he begins to speak this language. And as long as he speaks this language, he draws a follower. You hear me? Because in the best of African and African American leadership traditions, leaders are mouthpieces of the will of the people. That's what King said. He said, I didn't start the Montgomery bus boycott. When the people called on me, I stepped forward as a spokesperson for freedom. He understood that was his role. Of course, he brought in his own message. But essentially, it was one that was voicing and articulating the position of the masses who wanted to see an end to segregation, who wanted certain rights, including the right to vote, restored. Particularly, it was a movement, as they called it, they didn't call it no civil rights movement. It was a Black freedom movement. And it was improvised the same way that Dizzy and Miles improvised their music on the spur of the moment. You hear me? Garvey did the same thing, but he's now under the influence of this African in America while they're under his influence. But our people wake him up, and then he is waking us up to another potential, which, by the way, many Africans have seen ourselves as then and now as a nation within a nation. And so Garvey was giving a concrete example of that in his organization that's a nation in exile, exiled in the United States, one of the most barbaric places on earth, supported mainly by Southern Blacks who are coming out of Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, places where you get lynched for just being Black in the wrong place at the wrong time. Queen Mother Moore talked about. She was a great African leader in this country, a former Garveyite. And she talked about how when Garvey came to Louisiana, I think it was New Orleans, to speak, chief of police wouldn't allow him to get into the theater. The Garvey members came with guns. Chief of police opened the door, sat in the front row. Garvey spoke. His base was in the South, but he couldn't get his movement off the ground in Jamaica. This African here was receptive to that. And then it got off the ground in the Caribbean, in South America, and in other parts of the world. So this African, who's not supposed to have any culture, fueled this movement, and it was fueled by new African culture. And this new addition to it, race consciousness, or race first. That was Tony Martin's title to his book on Garvey, you know. And Garvey really has an appeal to Blacks when he starts formulating things in racial terms. Black people can really pick that up through his Universal Negro Improvement Association newspaper. So as Garvey began to speak the language of Blacks because he had undergone conversion in his thought pattern, he's able to appeal to Blacks. One reason why Southern Blacks would be his base of support isn't just because the majority of Blacks still lived in the South. His strongest chapter was in New York, and his second one was in Philadelphia because Blacks had more freedom of movement. They had more money. They could finance an organization out in the open. They could hold huge rallies that you couldn't do in certain areas of the South. So that was where his strongest chapters were, New York and Philadelphia. And Malcolm's parents, mother and father, were both Garveyites coming out of the Philadelphia chapter, you know. And Elijah Muhammad himself was a corporal in the Garvey movement, you know, and a host of other Black folks. But the main reason that the South was so receptive, Southern Blacks, was because that was also the base for the sentiment of Africa return. Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, who was a great immigrationist leader, someone that said that blacks should leave this country and go back to Africa, was based in the South. Henry Adams, who was one of many grassroots black leaders who come out of the Civil War and who are working on plantations, organizing from plantation to plantation and serving as mouthpieces of the people. One of the platforms of his organization that came from grassroots blacks was an Africa Return. So you had Africans in the South who were sympathetic to this view. It wasn't just that Garvey converted them, but Garvey brought in a full-blown view of Africans ruling themselves under their own government. And then the African American had the view as the African in the Caribbean had of one Africa that we gave birth to. Now, Garveyism was strong when it reflected the positive aspects of African American popular culture and African Caribbean popular culture. And of course, the positive features of African culture in general. And he was respected because he was a mouthpiece for those positive aspects. But it's the weak underbelly of new African culture that, since we haven't studied it, we find ourselves infected by it and often not addressing it or treating it as just the normal because slavery was so abnormal, because that's what we were, when far from the truth. But there was this negative underbelly, and we find it in both the African Caribbean culture and we find it in the African American culture. And I would say overall, this weak underbelly has to do with a difficulty of Africans dealing with Africa. This thing when I started this part of this discussion off where I ain't no African. Don't call me no African. You hear me? That mentality. Because this comes from the brainwashing of enslavement. And having had stuffed in our heads this jive teaching that was taught in the Caribbean, South America, the United States, this teaching over and over. A savage in Africa, a slave in America, or a slave in the Caribbean, or a slave in South America. First generation Africans laughed at that. We named everything African. And second and third. But over a period of time, some of us succumbed to that. And to this day, you got Africans talking about, I remember I was in Kansas City years ago, and a sister comes into the house off the street, and she says, are Africans still savages? Are they civilized yet? It was just a matter of fact conversation. It wasn't like a joke. You know what I mean? Huh? You're living under savagery and barbarism. And you think your people are savages? Really? Huh? And then all the names that grassroots blacks call continental blacks, jungle bunnies and all kinds of bunk. You hear me? Huh? Go watch a Tarzan movie and all of that. That puts you in that frame of mind. So this anti-African undercurrent is a real weakness to this day in the popular culture. So this brainwashing instilled through enslavement led even some of our best leaders to pick this up. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad, for example, when Malcolm is forced out of the nation, he starts telling things. And one of the things he told is Elijah didn't like Africa. And that's the truth. He didn't. That's a part of the brainwashing. And the nation had a lot of positive features, you know, Black pride. They drew on race consciousness. Elijah Muhammad had read J. Rogers and a lot of the other basic writings. He wasn't a historian, he wasn't a scholar like Malcolm, but he was grounded enough in the history and culture to understand things about Blackness. And he was able to craft, along with Fard Muhammad and others, this new formulation of a religion that's kind of a hodgepodge of different things called Islam, more Christian than Islam, but it was suited to the mindset of blacks in America. So it was smart, you know what I mean? Real smart. And he was able to take a lot of cats in prison, turn them around. And then Malcolm took them to higher ground because Malcolm underwent a deeper conversion and transformation than Elijah did, or any of the people around him. That's the sixfold stages to mental freedom. Elijah's conversion was heavily spiritual or religious and was black in its orientation. Didn't want anything to do with Africa. And if you note Malcolm in the Nation of Islam, he ain't talking as much Pan-Africanism as he talks when he's out. He talks mainly, this was his way of skirting the messenger's anti-African thing, though he would talk Africa in terms of history. When it came to politics, you didn't hear a lot of talk about Pan-Africanism, but he would talk about the conference that was held where Asians, Africans, and others met, the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, sponsored by C.O.R.E. So that was his way of being able to get an internationalist position out there. But Elijah had problems with Africa. And I would say to the extent that leaders have problems with the root, they're going to have problems with the fruit in some area of their culture. And it's going to put them in a weaker position. And it can open them up more to things, in the case of the Nation of Islam, corruption. Now, I'm not saying identifying with Africa will make you non-corrupt, but I'm saying it's a part of the transformation of consciousness that can ground you in a deep sense of love of your people that will take you away from some of these compromising tendencies around which materialism is central, you know? And that became a problem with the nation, among many others, you know, along with their positive aspects. So our best leaders have to cope with the negatives in the popular culture. And it's the degree to which you don't embrace the positive and sink into the negative that you can find you in trouble as a leader. Your movements are in trouble. So Garvey had a distaste for some of the deepest things that were African found in Afro-Jamaican culture, and some of the deepest things that were African found in African-American culture. He embraced race consciousness, never used the word Pan-Africanism, but this one Africa, and a number of other common features. And of course, he came out of a maroon tradition of resistance, you know. But there were features of African culture transmitted and recreated in the Caribbean and African-American setting that he had trouble with. So while he embraced a lot of positive features of African Caribbean, African American culture, he had a problem that the newly independent leaders of Africa had, and the leaders of Africa still have. While he embraced the idea of Africans ruling themselves, his conception of rulership was heavily European. Heavily European. It wasn't just based on the regalia he wore, but his conception of how governments should work. For example, Garvey had no trouble embracing World War I, and particularly King George, the King of England. Wrote him a letter, I've mentioned this before, telling him how much he loved him, Garvey. When he came to the US, he was pro-war. You hear me? And when he attended those meetings where he found the new Negro, he had still been in a pro-war stance. It's when he embraces race consciousness and picks up this militant mood coming from the grassroots that he begins to transform his pro-war stance. Of course, remember, a lot of these blacks who took an anti-war stance had fought in the war. So don't forget that. I'm not trying to put them on a pedestal. They had been misled and angry when they came back. They're fighting for a country that's going to lynch them. That's why my father refused to fight in World War II. You know what I mean? So Garvey had to undergo conversion coming out of this case, popular African American culture, to get him on the right track when it came to his attitude towards war. And in this case, England's war, because the U.S. was fighting, but he was a colonial subject of the British. So while he embraced some positive aspects of both African Caribbean, in this case Jamaican culture, and African American culture, he also embraced some negative views coming out of both African American and Jamaican culture, or towards institutions established in those cultures. Obia, O-B-E-A, that is a tradition found in the Protestant colonial situation or enslavement situation in this country. In places where Catholicism was not practiced, then Africans couldn't continue the whole spiritual system that you find in voodoo in Haiti, or Santeria in Cuba, or a form of that in Brazil, and in other Catholic countries. You could or in Louisiana, where you could hold on to a more intact spiritual system. Under the Protestant system, that wasn't continued because it was hard to hide your system under the Protestant system, whereas under the Catholic system, you could hide the orishas or the spirits under the saints in the Catholic one. And so it, was more intact. And so Obia is the institution of the priesthood of divination, of divining, of predicting the future. Du Bois had described the Obia leaders as the healers of the sick, the comforter of the sorrowful, and the rude leaders of the masses of the people. And that pretty much described their role all over the Western Hemisphere. They were the natural leaders. They were the comforters of the sorrowful. They were the ones who the people went to in times of distress. And they were the ones who, based on divination, could give them a sense of the promise of their future. So Garvey had instilled in him, as a lot of Blacks in the U.S., particularly after enslavement did, the idea that the Obia man or woman was in league with the devil. And so there was a little song that they had that in part explains the reduction of influence of Obia after particularly the end of slavery in the Caribbean and the United States. And it goes something like this: Satan is a liar and a conjurer too. If you don't mind out, he'll conjure you. Conjuring, C-O-N-J-U-R-I-N-G, is divination, but it's being treated as devil worship. But it was the major thing that got us over. And a lot of these diviners, they were healers. And remember, in enslavement, the average age of a Black person, enslaved Black person, was no more than 50, but some lived to 126 years of age. Those diviners helped contribute to that because they were into herbs. They were all in all kinds of healing medicine and everything else. You understand? And at the end of enslavement, those Africans still with enough sense to draw on that. That was the main thing that would keep them alive and healthy. No medical system for them, So Garvey's view of this, he described Obia as that dirty Obia. This was an expression of contempt for one of the most important spiritual institutions that Africa had recreated in the Western Hemisphere in the United States. And part of this would probably come from his exposure to Christianity, and particularly in the Caribbean, which is a straight up form. And he was himself a Catholic. In America, the African in America Africanizes Christianity a whole lot more than in the Caribbean, though there are African forms in the Caribbean, some of which come from the US, some of them are in the Caribbean, but a lot of them straight out coming out of Europe. Garvey's view of the art form of the African in the United States, the blues and the spirituals, was that European classical music was better. Had we been exposed to it, we probably wouldn't have done this. It was precisely because we were exposed to the culture. We weren't going to no concerts in enslavement. And if we did, we would have fallen asleep, just as we did when we heard the preaching coming from these white preachers talking about slave, obey your masters, quoting from the Pauline epistles that blacks, those few that became Christians in the U.S., because very few were during enslavement, rejected. The one thing a former enslaved black would never want to hear is the Pauline epistles. Say it, they'd almost throw the Bible at you. You hear me? Those that were Christians. So Garvey's view of the art form was again a reflection of a certain level of assimilation, in this case, on the artistic level. And that affects your thought pattern on other levels. So this part of the discussion may be unpleasant, but it's the truth. And it's the truth we got to deal with. The truth is that we have to work harder to draw deeply from our own African roots. The people that watch this show, they're coming out of an Afrocentric perspective. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the masses of our people, because that is the basis for what's the best in them, So we need to overcome these negative features of enslavement, the N word, the B word, that's being popularized like it's normal today, legacies of slavery. At the same time, some of the same people are drawing from some of the positive features that I've just referred to, not understanding the difference or trying to treat a negative as a positive. Talking about the N word is about love because they come up with a different way of saying it. Nah, that came off of the plantation. And when you have it, it's a reflection of a plantation mindset. So while this may be an unpleasant part of the discussion, it's offering alternatives that if we're going to have creative leadership, if we're going to really be able to institutionalize that, or creative people on any level, the creativity is going to be greater to the degree that we can draw from the strongest parts of our roots. And the most important thing is to be able to acknowledge, to respect and appreciate and know those African roots that lie deep inside your soul, to understand it, cultivate it, and bring it out. So just as Garvey underwent a transformation from a British pro-war consciousness to a race-conscious, anti-war, anti-racist, creative Black leadership kind of consciousness, we need to wade in the water of African identity. We need to undergo whatever transformation we need based on the stage that we're at right now. We need to work on, and I know many of us are, but those of us that are not, being the best at whatever it is we do. And first, best means best human being we can possibly be. And it doesn't mean better than somebody else, our best. And this mastery system is key to that. So, in concluding this, African American culture or new African culture is our way of life and design for living. I have a comprehensive definition of it. I'm not going into that. But I'll simply say that when you have a jewel You want to keep that jewel in good condition. You want to polish it. And your greatest jewel resides in your souls. And it's cultivating the jewels in our soul. And the most beautiful are the jewels that grow out of Africa, recreated here, minus the negatives. And so the sixfold stages to mental freedom that I'll be getting into more as an introduction at another point, and the 4 stages of mastery in the Dogon and 3 in the African American. These are paths for the roads to transformation, which even if you didn't know about these, you're probably dealing with as you plunge deeper into yourself and undergo self-cultivation to be a better person, a more conscious person, a more creative person, a better human being. Kinder and more gentle, more creative, more loving. And ultimately, this is about love. So, creative Black leadership is an expression of the popular culture of our people, and it is an expression of the best of traditional African, ancient African culture as well, which we need when it comes to reviving, strengthening this new African culture. So I hope you got something out of this. Hotep. We got any questions here? I see comments. I saw a lot of comments coming in, but are there any questions or comments that we've got Michelle Mayberry. Glad to have you, Michelle. Love to my Dogon family. Yeah, beautiful. Gladys Harris. Whoa, keep on moving. Good leadership. Black people. Hey. SKNRBG. Peace and power for St. Kitts and Nevis. Right on. Hey, hey, hey. Right on. I tell my wife, she's from Barbados. I haven't been there. I want to go. Okay. Any comments? Any questions? That's the whole point of this. That's why we do this and have a chat, so we can have a chat. Any questions? Before I tune out, I don't want to tune out without getting any questions. Loud Zoo, you got any questions or comments? Brother Dreamchild, you got any? Michelle, thanks for your comment. Ed Donaldson, thanks. Any comments? Any questions? Well, let me put a question up here for you all. How do you define African or New African culture? And while you're thinking about that, Michelle Mayberry, Baba, what are your thoughts on Juneteenth? I see that I got a notice from some of our scholars debating whether or not we should have Juneteenth. I think it's fine. It's telling you about the time in which Black people got notified of their emancipation. I think the key thing is to know that we freed ourselves. And while in Texas and some places they had held off the notice of that Abraham Lincoln didn't free us, or Emancipation Proclamation, which applied only to the areas in which Blacks were enslaved. And those areas, where Blacks were on plantation, those Southerners, those slave masters were not going to free us. It was designed to encourage us to rebel It was also designed to prevent Britain from recognizing the South, which had they done it, there would have been succession. The North would have lost the Civil War because they were having trouble winning until 170,000 Black Union Army men and a few women disguised as men started blowing away their slave masters. So I think it's good. The people know that. Osiah Keppel, I'd like to know more about your sixfold stages program qualification. Okay. We are going to do on a webinar that will go on for a year, twice a month, 2 to 3 hours each time. I'll have people assisting me. So we've broken down into groups of 10. This will be going through the sixfold stages to mental freedom. I'll go over the overview of that at another point. But for this to work, you're going to also have to be involved in something in your community, because this is a transformational system that doesn't work the way university education does, or public schools where you're reading something and taking a test. No, this is the test of life. And that means you're engaged in a process of liberation of some kind. Take on your own based on what you're interested in doing. You know what I mean? You might be teaching in the community. You might be helping with parenting of children, whatever it is, but it's got to be something that's uplifting to the community. So the qualifications are that you sign up, indicate an interest, and just send me under the notice of the show, underneath the show, just put a note saying that I want to enroll in the sixfold stages to mental freedom. I'll have on there your email address, and so I can contact you as we're beginning to prepare to launch this, because we're going to have to pick times that are convenient, most convenient for most people, and so forth. And then preparation, they're going to be things people have to prepare for to do this. But the only qualification is an interest in growing, in terms of your own identity. And this is a two-way process. This isn't just people. These are people that I've taken through this process over 50 years, and they've been applying this to their families, on their jobs, wherever they work, in organizing, whatever. But in the process of this transformation, we're learning from each other. And it's suited to people's stage of development. So the only qualification is that you have an interest in learning. Okay, so Ed and Osiah, both of you, just put a note saying that at the end of the comments sections under these screens, when that are put up when you're looking at the show, not on the live thing, put up your request to be a part of this, and I'll have your email address coming through that, or give it to me, and then we can stay in touch with you. Okay. Brother Dreamchild, been moving through your second Art of Leadership books, or two Art of Leadership books. Yeah, most people that have read the Art of Leadership have read volume 1, but not volume 2. And I want to say to people who haven't subscribed to the show, subscribe. That's the whole point, to grow the show. And if you can, make a donation. I put a lot of money into this show, and some people have made some donations, which is helpful. As we grow the show, we can do more. I don't want to have corporate sponsors. I don't want to be advertising stuff, because I fought the corporations. They're bleeding the planet. And so I'm going to be advertising them for whatever they got to offer? No. So hopefully you can provide some help that way, and just let people know about the show. Okay. Thank you, and hope you got something out of this. Hotep. And remember, next week, Emory Douglas will be on, and he'll be doing a presentation on his art, former Minister of Culture, Black Panther Party. Hotep.